17. That was the age when beauty became a crime. Your cheeks lost their softness, your voice deepened, and the empire no longer saw you as treasure. It saw you as risk, and risks were not tolerated. The Ottoman palace had protocols for everything, and even for disposal. Some boys were sold again, stripped of silks and chained as servants. Others were fed to brothels or thrown into gladiatorial arenas for nobles' amusement. Some simply disappeared, their names crossed out, their beds filled by someone younger. But the rarest fate of all was survival, and those who lived long. Enough to be forgotten became something worse than victims. They became reminders. This is the story not just of how boys were used, but of how they were erased. You turned 17 and everything changed. Your skin was no longer porcelain, your hips no longer curved. Your voice had deepened just enough to remind your masters you were no longer a boy, and that made you dangerous, because now you were. A memory. You had seen too much, heard too much, survived too long, and survival, in this system, was not rewarded. The ledger of disposal Ottoman palace officials didn't need to improvise your fate. They had protocols, detailed scrolls labeled Concubine Lifecycle Management, bureaucratic language for the disposal of people. The empire treated boys the same way it treated falcons, spices, or carpets, with usage charts. After a certain age, you were reclassified, from ornamental asset to expired domestic, from companion class to security risk. There were 5 possible outcomes. None of them were mercy. Resale to lower nobility. The least painful fate was reallocation. You were sold again, this time to minor officials, middle-tier merchants, or retired generals. These men didn't care for training. They bought bodies. Here, you were not expected to entertain with poetry or dance. You were expected to endure, to be silent, to obey. The rooms were smaller, the punishments less creative but more brutal. You learned quickly that the closer you were to the top, the less they needed to hit you. Down here, the whip replaced wine. Chains replaced silks. You weren't a pearl anymore. You were meat. Transfer to state-controlled brothels in cities like Bursa, Tripoli, and Cairo. State-run brothels operated behind innocuous facades, bathhouses, tea shops, caravanserais. Inside, corridors lined with rooms just wide enough for a cot and a lock. You were registered as a licensed service companion. The official euphemism. Your clients ranged from janissaries to foreign traders. You could serve 20 in a night, 40 during festivals. Your only rest came when your body collapsed faster than demand. If you resisted, you were rotated to the night shift units. No lights, no food, no names. Most didn't survive 6 months, but no one came looking, because to the empire, you were now non-essential inventory. Combat for amusement. If you were strong and still pretty, you might be chosen for something else. The games. Once a month, select concubines past their prime were paraded before high-ranking officials and military commanders. The event was billed as recreation, but it was bloodsport. Boys were given knives, sometimes dull, told to fight for their lives. The winner might earn an extra week of food or a month of reprieve from sexual service. But more often they were made to fight again and again, until they lost or went mad. It wasn't about survival. It was about showing the elite how broken beauty could be turned into brutality. Silent eliminations. Some boys never made it to resale or brothels. They simply disappeared. Their names were crossed out in thin black ink, their beds filled by someone younger, their belongings burned. The official cause? Accident, illness, melancholic deterioration. But those inside the system knew the signs. Sudden changes in dietary regimen or to conceal poison, transfers to isolated wings, for strangulation, disappearances after private audiences with influential guests, no funerals. No farewells, just absence. Some boys begged to be chosen this way, not because they wanted to die, but because it meant no more nights. Cool. Lifelong silence. The broken men. The rarest fate was survival. A few boys lived past 20, past 30. They were no longer concubines. They were ghosts. They shuffled through palace corridors, eyes downcast, lips sealed, assigned to maintenance, archives, laundry, far from the eyes of guests. They were known as broken men. No one spoke to them. No one mentioned them. But every boy saw what they became. Some had tremors. Some spoke to walls. Some flinched at any male voice. And all of them wore the same expression, one of permanent, unnatural calm. A smile without. Joy, a face that had forgotten its name. They weren't kept alive out of kindness. They were reminders, living warnings, proof of what happened when a boy outlived his beauty, but not his obedience. The price of memory, if you were ever caught speaking. Of your past, even whispering to a new recruit. Punishment was swift, public beatings, tooth removal, branding. Repeat offenders were blinded, not because you were a threat, but because your memories were. The empire could tolerate beauty, it could tolerate decay, but it could never tolerate testimony. So it erased not just your body, but your voice, your past, your future. You became a myth, a rumor, a sigh beneath the silk cushions of history. Your old name was taken from you the day you were selected, but it wasn't enough to silence who you were. They needed to make you forget. Not just your language, not just your faith. They needed to erase your sense of self so completely that even your own reflection would lie to you. This was not punishment. This was policy. The architecture of erasure began with isolation. Boys newly collected from villages were not immediately introduced to the palace or even to each other. They were placed in windowless rooms where time meant nothing. Days blurred, nights echoed, meals came at random intervals, with no explanation. Silence was enforced. Any attempt to speak in your native tongue was met with immediate punishment, not by adults, but by older boys who had already been broken. They were your first wardens and your first warning. The lesson was clear. The past is death. Speak it, and you invite it. Humiliation as curriculum, you were stripped daily, not just of clothes, but of dignity, told to crawl for food. Made to recite verses that praised your new masters, forced to thank the men who beat you, not just aloud, but with a bow. The empire didn't just teach submission, it made worship of pain part of your education. Each session included a psychological component. You were asked to renounce your mother's name. You were made to describe your own village as a place of darkness. You were tested and rewarded for how convincingly you could say, "I was born for this." Obedience was not enough. They wanted conviction. The science of breaking Ottoman training manuals detailed how to identify each boy's weakness. For one child, it was hunger. For another, fear of isolation. For many, the sound of other children screaming. Instructors were assigned trauma maps. Each boy's profile listed psychological vulnerability, resistance level, preferred manipulation method. They used starvation, silence, affection, and reward in rotating cycles, a method later mirrored by modern interrogators centuries ahead. They weren't training servants, they were crafting reflexes. By the time your training ended, you smiled when struck, you kneeled when touched. You asked to be used, not because you wanted it, but because wanting had been surgically removed. Rituals of rebirth. The final stage of transformation was presentation, a ceremonial event masked in opulence where you were introduced to court eunuchs, instructors, and sometimes potential owners. You were dressed in gold-trimmed robes perfumed with jasmine and myrrh, and given a new name, a Turkish name, one chosen to suit your appearance or to honor a previous concubine who had served well. In that moment, your past ceased to exist. No one would ever call you by your birth name again. If you ever dared speak it, you would be lashed in public. Your tongue split as punishment for clinging to a self that had been lawfully erased, and the others, they cheered, because they knew, the more convincingly you shed your past, the longer you might survive your future. The language of obedience. You were not taught to speak. You were taught to respond. Every word was a performance. My body belongs to the Sultan. His pleasure is my purpose. Pain is the voice of discipline. These phrases were drilled like catechisms, repeated before meals, before rest. before use. Each phrase had a gesture: hand over heart, bow from the waist, eyes lowered. It was not language, it was submission choreography, a ballet of silence, perfected in fear. And when you performed well, you received warm water for bathing, silk cushions, even a sweet pastry. Rewards designed not for joy, but for conditioning. Turning victims into instructors. Perhaps the cruelest brilliance of the system was this: it made its own victims into its strongest enforcers. Older concubines who had survived were elevated, not to freedom, but to function. They became trainers, punishers, disciplinarians, and they knew exactly how to break a boy, because they had once been broken in the same way. Some wept during punishments, others took pride in perfection, viewing the boy's collapse as a success of the system. But the end result was the same: a chain of trauma, unbroken, passed from one victim to the next like a torch of suffering. Why they never fought back, you might wonder. Why didn't they resist? Why didn't they run? The answer is horrifyingly simple: they no longer believed they existed. After years of conditioning, of isolation, of trauma designed to erase thought, even hope became a foreign idea. You didn't think of escape. You thought of how to breathe more quietly, how to smile more softly, how to vanish better. Because vanishing, being useful, silent, perfect, was the only form of survival left. No one ever built a graveyard for the boys. No tombstones mark their names. No monuments rise in their memory. They disappeared as they lived. Inside palaces they were never allowed to leave. Inside bodies they were trained to betray. And even in death, the system made sure their stories remained unspoken, because the Ottoman Empire didn't just exploit these children, it engineered amnesia. It built entire bureaucracies to erase them. The machinery of forgetting. The same scribes who documented taxes and military campaigns also recorded concubine registries, but unlike soldiers or administrators, these boys had no surnames, no lineage, no graves. Only file numbers and notations like assigned to inner chamber, transferred to viziral house, expired after seasonal illness. Even death was euphemized. Expired could mean starvation, torture, suicide, or sanctioned murder. The documents were stored in locked archives, protected not by guards, but by shame. Ottoman historians knew these scrolls existed. They simply chose not to read them. The silent diplomats' European visitors occasionally glimpsed the truth. A British ambassador in the 18th century wrote of boys dressed in sapphires, eyes dulled by silence. A French merchant described a child brought out with more ceremony than gold. A Venetian priest recorded whispered confessions from a broken eunuch who had once trained concubines, but none of them intervened. Some were complicit. Some were amused. Others simply turned away, because to speak against the Sultan's pleasure was to question the legitimacy of his empire, and no merchant or diplomat dared risk trade routes over boys buried in perfume. The echoes in the villages back. In the Balkans, the legacy of Devshirme never faded. Entire villages bore the scars of systematic child collection. Parents stopped naming their children after saints, afraid it would draw the wrong attention. Some families buried boys in the forest during levy years, hoping death by exposure was kinder than capture. Others surrendered their sons voluntarily in exchange for grain or tax exemption, or simply the vague hope that perhaps he'll become someone important. The empire knew how to weaponize hope just as well as fear, but once taken, the boys never returned. Those who did were no longer boys. They were shadows in foreign clothing, with foreign tongues, staring at mothers they no longer recognized. The ghost in the empire. By the 19th century, Western pressures forced the Ottomans to officially end the Devshirme system, but its ghost remained. The brothels still operated. The courts still accepted tribute boys. The palaces still whispered. The only thing that changed was the language. Now it was called court companionship. Now the boys were not slaves, they were favored servants, but the silk changed nothing. They were still bought, still broken. still disappeared, and the records continued, always written in ink, never in blood, because the empire had learned that blood washes away faster. Why the history disappeared. Modern Turkish historians rarely speak of male concubinage. It's not because the records don't exist, it's because the implications do. To confront the reality of systematic boy exploitation is to challenge the image of the Ottoman Empire as a beacon of Islamic enlightenment, as a model of multicultural rule, as a civilized counterweight to Western imperialism. But truth does not need permission, and the truth is this: the empire perfected a system where boys were stolen, silenced, and sacrificed, not by rogue actors, not by individual monsters, but by the machinery of governance itself. What was lost, we do not know their names. We will never know how many. But we know this: they sang in rooms where no one listened. They smiled through bruises that no one saw. They learned to bow so deeply that they forgot how to stand, and they died as they lived, beautiful, obedient, invisible. Final reflection: they were boys, not soldiers, not traitors. Not threats, just boys, stolen from their homes, stripped of their faith, carved into instruments of pleasure for an empire that recorded their uses, but never their souls. And the silence that followed was not natural. It was designed by emperors, by scribes, by history itself, which is why, even centuries later, speaking their truth is not just uncomfortable, it's rebellion, and maybe it's justice.